all black, everything.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here as usual at the John Hope Franklin Center on Duke University's campus. And we are joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Christian Gregory. Now, I'm sure Dr. Christian Gregory's patients know him as a fine chiropractor in the city of Washington, D.C. For those who don't know, he is one of the 10 children of the legendary comedian and activist Dick Gregory. Thanks for joining us here today,
Thank you, Professor.
Christian.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, besides being a chiropractor, one of your jobs the last 20 years has been, kind of managing your father's career.
My primary job.
And then now as kind of the executor of his estate afterwards. Let's just start with that first question. What was it like growing up as a child of Dick Gregory?
Epic. Yeah, epic. Never a dull moment. It's as colorful as anyone's wildest imaginations could conceive. It was such a blessing, though, for all of us Gregory children. Frequently we were asked that question, what was it? And it just was, for us, that was our normal. And as we got older, we became clear that was our normal was quite abnormal, but it was normal for us, and it really planted the seeds of activism deep with it. I honestly feel it's nature versus nurture. I feel like some of it was genetically gifted to us, but to have all of your children involved in activism in various different sorts. I frequently say there's no bigger humanitarian issue than health. And so we're in the health field, we're in the legal field, we're in the education field. My dad was primarily an educator more than anything else. So I feel so good to be here with you at Duke.
You're one of the younger siblings. I wonder how much you knew of your father's legacy, particularly in terms of comedy. Your father was really the first major breakthrough in terms of black comedians who crossed over to the mainstream.
Absolutely.
I mean, you'd really have to go back to think about Burt Williams at the beginning of the 20th century to think of another example. So he's sitting, on these chairs next to the Jack Parrs and the Johnny Carsons. White America has a kind of access to him that they didn't have the other black comedians, and everybody comes afterwards, right? Cosby's career, is created, in some ways, Richard Pryor sees his early career as some sort of combination of Dick Gregory and Bill Cosby. So he really is the portal, that gets us to the Dave Chappelle and these other folks, Wanda Sykes and folks like that now. How aware were you of that as a kid?
Well, this is odd and great question. So really aware, not because he brought that home. At home, he was just dad.
Yeah.
But in school, and not because, Dick Gregory's children go here, so we're going to study his class. My dad was always part of my coursework. When I graduated from chiropractic school, he gave the commencement address, and undergrad gave the commencement address. So the education and my dad are always kind of synonymous. So I knew more about his activism. We always knew he was wildly funny, but knew more about his activism growing up. And as I became older and started hearing other folks, and my dad reinvented himself a lot, from nutritionist to activist to comedian to athlete. So I learned it was almost like a multi-personality. I learned all these other entities that I didn't necessarily know as a child. But at home for us, he was just dad. He checked all of that at the door and became dad. And we're grateful because it definitely balanced us and helped us to have as quote unquote normal as of a life that we could have. And it worked out well. He was very wise in that regard.
He was very much a celebrity and an activist. In some ways, you could argue that he even sacrificed a ton of his career, right, in order to be out there on the front lines. He tells the story himself about being on the front lines with folks in Mississippi and places like that. His relationship with Medgar Evers,
it's profound,
for instance. And so he sets an example, right? And it's a different moment, right? When you think about a Dick Gregory or a Harry Belafonte or a Nina Simone, the roles, Lorraine Hansberg, right? How important it was for them as artists and entertainers to really engage the civil rights movement at the time. Do you see that same kind of energy now amongst both the activists and the entertainers, if you will?
No. And in fairness, it's a very different time, but definitely, I mean, pressure and heat makes steel, sustained pressure on coal makes diamonds. We had a lot of real gems that came out of that generation, not just ironically, but because of the times they were very different. So I don't see that now. I see it more being an option now, and it was almost mandatory then. It wasn't mandatory for all folks to go all in, like some folks did. And my dad
folks were writing checks,
we were writing
and
checks,
show up
and
at
they
an
would
event,
tap one foot in and then tap right to a show. My dad ultimately left comedy completely, and this just shows how the universe works. Because when he left comedy completely, joined, and I'll be quick through this, joined the civil rights movement. Medgar Evers placed a call to him. He joined Medgar. He had just, and I can't even put into words the admiration he had for Sergeant Evers. It just was profound. That was truly the catalyst for him going all in. He joined Dr. King's nonviolent movement, and he theorized, if I'm committing to not being violent to other human beings, I'm not going to be violent to animals, and that's when he became a vegan, and that started that whole health trajectory. And so when he returned to entertainment, and this is what I'm getting, because this is very important, he refused to go to nightclubs and bars because of alcohol and because of tobacco. So it led him to college campuses. So as a result, you have no more apt pupil than a 18, 19, 20-year-old. So they're forming, and developmentally, and so I literally, while my dad was living, and since he's passed, people have walked up to me from every walk of life and say, your dad was at my little college in whatever little town, and he said, and had he gone back to clubs, that would have never happened. So he wouldn't have had as significant of an impact had he gone a different route. So it was bigger than him, and he would be quick to acknowledge that, because he didn't think that all the way through. That wasn't the logic behind it. He just wanted folks to be healthy.
When Aretha Franklin passed away, and she had told these stories before in her life, when she was coming up in her father's house, it wasn't unusual on a Saturday night or a Friday night for all host of people to come through. So Dinah Washington's in town, she's coming to the house.
Absolutely.
Oscar Peterson's in town, he's coming to the house. What was the Dick Gregory household like when he was such a figure like Dick Gregory?
Good questions. My dad moved way off the grid. So we grew up on a massive farm in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So folks just didn't stumble by. When they came, it was by design, it was planned, and they normally stayed for long periods of time. So everyone from the Jacksons to my dad was very close with Michael and Janet Jackson, and
so wait a minute. So you're like little Christian Gregory.
Oh yeah.
And you wake up one day, hey Michael, what's up, Marlon?
I can remember a day my dad left me because he had to go somewhere, and left me for like 3 or 4 hours with Marvin Gaye, and it was just me and Marvin Gaye. And that was our normal. That was our normal, and so many people looked up to him. I can remember the first time I met Bill Cosby, he got down on his knees and kissed my dad's hand, and I'm a young kid, and of course, from watching TV and the Fat Albert, I knew of Bill Cosby. So to see, a lot of that made it very clear to us Gregorys by seeing other folks respond to your father. When Coretta Scott King passed away, my dad and I attended her funeral, and all of the living presidents were there. And one by one, and there was a lot of civil rights legends in that room, one by one, every president that walked in broke away from their security detail to hug my dad and thank him. It was the only person that it did. And sitting president then, George W. Bush, whispered in my dad's ear, you gave my commencement address. And so when he was at Yale, so this is just, so it's heavy, but it's not surprising, because my dad prepared us for it. He prepared us for it without saying it, but just from always having us involved with the process.
Do you ever sit around now wishing that there were handheld devices?
It probably would have destroyed us. Yeah, it probably, because we'd be running around saying, look at this, look at this. It's, I love technology, I embrace it. I'm glad it wasn't around when we were children. And so I'll leave it at that.
You're watching Left of Black. We're talking today with Dr. Christian Gregory, who is one of the 10 children of the late, great comedian and activist Dick Gregory. We're talking with him about his own work and also his work in dealing with the legacy of his father. One of those moments of his legacy, of course, is the new play, Turn Me Loose.
Absolutely.
Which opened in New York 2 years ago, where Joe Morton is lead.
Correct.
It's been out in Los Angeles. It was just had a run at the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. There'll be a short run in New York shortly. when the play was initially produced, your father was still alive,
Yes.
and he had a chance to see the performance.
And loved it. And so and that's rare. He realized how rare it was. And so he definitely was mindful of the fact that he was receiving his flowers while he was here. When my father transitioned, he was clear that he was loved and adored, not just by his family, but by the world, quite honestly. And so we were happy to have you out to see Turn Me Loose in New York with Joe and in DC with Edwin Lee Gibson. I get goosebumps as we're talking about it because, again, these are moments that speak to the heaviness of your father's contribution, because how many people lose a parent? And I was in DC, I was referring to it as appointment resurrection. Every time from 7:30 during the week and 8 p.m. on the weekend, I knew I could go and be with my dad. That's profound. I mean, it really is profound. I mean, the writing is so incredibly well done. Gretchen Law, and the production, all of the producers, it just is, they get it right, and they got it right. And it's, for us Gregory's, it's a little surreal. Sometimes it's a little too heavy. We got to step out for a moment, then step back in. But I've listened to some of the jokes my dad's told that I'm mindful of since about the age of 10, about, well, if the pilgrims could come here and discover America, I could go out into out in the parking lot right now and discover your car with you sitting in it, and all of these jokes, and to still hear them delivered and just get wild laughter. And laughter's medicine. So to think long after my dad's gone, he's still providing the therapeutic doses that he provided when he was here, and the upliftment, it's profound. It speaks to the man.
Yeah. Are you excited about the fact that, because there are young folks, when they think of Dick Gregory, it's a portrait of him in his older age, with the beard, very thin, no doubt with some camera,
and fiery,
right? Some camera shoved in his face, and you're waiting for one of those moments, like where folks are expecting that this might go off the rail.
Absolutely.
I think about that again with a lot of the kind of icons who passed away. Folks know Aretha Franklin for, not quite dressing in a way that we might think appropriate for someone her age.
Absolutely.
But are you excited about the fact that, through the play and, of course, with the release of some of his books,
people get to see the
documentary, that a younger generation of folks now being connected, to Dick Gregory? I mean, in some ways, it explains why Dave Chappelle is Dave Chappelle.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
To really understand who Dick Gregory is.
Absolutely. And very excited, because that's profoundly important. So I frequently say no country for old legends. I mean, I've been there where my dad's been knocked over by overzealous fans, and, people can love you to life or love you to death. And so it's important that, I used to consider myself will still do, a keeper of the light. So it's important that we protect those folks. And it becomes tough because the aging process doesn't discriminate. We're all going to get old. My dad had some pretty significant dementia. He was dealing with some early onset Alzheimer's. And so and that's where a lot of the anger came from. But even when you see some of the angriest, and I knew that because, that was Dad's anger at home. So, it's a fine line between passion and anger. I saw the whole spectrum of that growing up as a child, and did a lot of things to rightfully elicit that response. So, but to be able to allow younger generations to see the wit and wisdom, and then see that's the growth, and because we're all going to be there someday. So and he made himself so accessible. That's why there's so many. You take anyone, you or I, and someone have a 14-hour interview with us, blood sugar starts to change. And so a lot of people didn't see the totality of what brought that out. But he always ended with love. You're a beautiful brother. I love you. Thank you. And so I always could see the silver lining in that. And no one can question his passion. That's for certain. From birth until we lost him at the age of 84, he had 10 shows scheduled the week that we lost him. So he was still out there, and that's he went out the way he wanted to go out.
There's a way in which I remember the month before your dad died, CBS This Morning did a whole series, interviews with him, and the way that they really positioned him was almost like this last representative of this great American comic tradition. beginning with Samuel Clemens.
And that's how they reached out to us. I mean, we realized that's what CBS Sunday Morning News, which, the whole Gregory family were news junkies, so that was one of our favorite programs. So my dad was elated to do it. And there was probably like 8 different occasions they came and went on the road with him, recorded a lot of his shows, and most of that had to get edited out because it was Sunday morning. So, but it was fun. But yes, that was the takeaway. And at that point, we had, here I am, a healthcare provider, one of my dad's healthcare team. I still thought he was going to live forever, just because that was his, and he still is, quite honestly. But that was just his energy. And so, oddly enough, when we lost him, we were all kind of caught flat-footed, because we just were drawn into that magic that was Dick Gregory, that we're still continuing to feel. So I don't think they realized, and that was the motivating force for doing it. I think it was like you said, they wanted to show nothing new is happening, and we want to show that this man he's never, for him the beat went on, it just never stopped.
One of the reasons why you're visiting here at Duke, the Department of African American Studies has just received a wonderful gift from the estate of Jenny Lillian Corborgian.
Correct.
That's going to allow us to mount a semester-long public class on Dick Gregory and the Black comedic tradition.
Phenomenal.
Where we're using Dick Gregory as a kind of portal to talk about, the history of Black comedy, but also to engage the real issues around social justice and health concerns, health
Very
disparities.
Powerful.
That was at the center of your father's work.
Correct.
I imagine there has to be hundreds of university courses being taught in which some aspect of your father's career gets contained in the context of those classes. I'm thinking this might be really the first opportunity to do kind of a semester-long class that really digs into your father's legacy. How excited are you about what this class could possibly be?
Very excited. And so I'm thankful to all the players involved that have allowed this to come together. My dad would always say, education is not power, information is power. Yeah. And if we're isolating who has access to that information, it's a disservice. So the fact that it's going to be a public class and taught in a way that really the community will have access to it is just how he would have insisted. I still get my marching orders from my dad every morning, so he's not shy about coming down and letting you know how he feels about things. So everyone's duly noted. So this is powerful, and so this is as I mentioned in school, high school, undergrad, grad school. There were portions of my dad's writings, because he had 26 books, that were part of my schooling for a lifetime. So, so it was I went to Morgan State undergrad, so it was interesting to have professors tell me I got aspects of the story wrong. I said, no, I don't care what the book says. This was my life. There was clearly a bad edit in the book. So to now have this opportunity to have folks see because the totality of his life is bigger than any iteration of it. It's bigger than any of it, because he reinvented himself so many times. So the complete picture of his life that's where the magic is, to see someone so much sacrifice. I mean, it's just rare you see someone who would go out of their way to sacrifice for humankind and for the environment.
And it's funny, right? Because you could even argue that your father was an Afrofuturist. And I think about this in the sense that when I was in college in the mid-1980s, I'd seen your father enough times on television to know who he was. But mostly I remember ads in Essence magazine of him and his little can of powder and the Bahamian diet. And when you're 19 and 20 years old, it's like, okay, what is this, right? I remember when Bobby Seale published his barbecuing book, and barbecuing with Bobby, and folks are like, this guy's a revolutionary.
Exactly.
But now at 52 years old, I'm like, some of the stuff that he was actually talking about is actually relevant to me now.
I mean, no question about it. I like that Afrofuturist. My dad always saw life through a different lens. I mean, he would always he talked about a black president, not just because he ran for president, because he foresaw that long before folks took him even remotely serious about it. He talked about a future where we don't use, where we don't write and don't use language. And now we see emojis and all the symbols that folks are communicating with. He was a visionary, and he really never looked back. I mean, when we get older, we get a little more reflective. And so the 20 years that he and I was shoulder to shoulder, because in addition to being his son, I was his healthcare provider and manager. So we spent tremendous amount of times for them. So incredibly grateful for. But once in a while, he would get a little reflective, and then it was almost like he was ashamed of himself and almost a flinch, and then fast forward again. So no, he was a dynamic human being. That is for certain.
Since your father's death, is there one story that you've heard about him that's really surprised you?
Not one, but the first one that's going to kind of rapid recall was after my dad passed. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did an interview with the LA Times. Actually, he wrote a piece for the LA Times and said he met Dick Gregory for one time for 5 minutes at a rally in Brooklyn, and it changed his life. The whole article was about.
So this is high school.
One.
This is high school.
It would have been young Kareem, most likely high school, correct? He met him at a rally, and it changed his life. He attributed everything he went on to do with sports and athleticism and activism and spirituality, and which is powerful. And then it made me feel a little shameful to say, wait a minute, this guy in 5 minutes changed his entire trajectory. I had it for a lifetime. I got work to do.
Yeah. We've been joined today by Dr. Christian Gregory, one of the 10 children of the legendary comedian activist, Dick Gregory. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.